The brochure for Lakeside Vistas promised a sanctuary. The glossy pages were filled with images of serene water features, perfectly manicured gardens, and smiling residents enjoying a life of peaceful, maintenance-free living. For me, it wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a necessity. After the accident that had stolen the use of my younger sister Chloe's legs, and after I had walked away from my career in international logistics to become her full-time caregiver, a place like this seemed like a haven, a ground floor, fully accessible condominium where the biggest challenge would be deciding which book to read by the pool, a place where we could finally exhale. My name is Sarah, and for the past 2 years, my world had been a maelstrom of hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and a legal battle that had left us emotionally and financially drained. Chloe, once a dancer whose spirit was as fluid and graceful as her body, was now navigating a world from the seat of a wheelchair. But her spirit, I was determined, would not be broken. This move was our fresh start, a deliberate step into a life defined not by trauma, but by tranquility. The tranquility lasted less than a single day. We were directing the movers as they carefully navigated Chloe's custom-built ramp up to our front door. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, made of a warm, weatherproof composite that blended with the tones of the flagstone patio. It was discreet, functional, and compliant with every letter of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was our bridge to a new life. A woman with a helmet of iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from a block of disapproval came marching across the pristine lawn. She was wearing a blindingly white pantsuit and a pained expression, as if the mere sight of our moving truck was causing her physical discomfort. "I am Barbara Petrov," she announced, her voice a low, authoritarian rumble. She did not introduce herself so much as she presented a fact. "I am the president of the Lakeside Vistas Homeowners Association." She said president with the same gravity a judge might use to say guilty. Her eyes, small and dark, ignored me completely and settled on the ramp. A faint sneer played on her thin lips. "What?" she asked, the word dripping with disdain. "Is that—" "It's a wheelchair ramp for my sister," I said, stepping between her and the movers, my protective instincts flaring. "We had it professionally installed this morning." "It is non-compliant," she declared, as if delivering a verdict. "All exterior modifications, regardless of purpose, must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval. Furthermore, the color that sandy brown is not on the approved palette. It clashes with the community beige trim work." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer, breathtaking callousness of her complaint was staggering. She wasn't looking at a necessary medical accommodation. She was looking at a color swatch violation. "It's a wheelchair ramp," I repeated, my voice tight. "It's a federally protected reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. We don't need the committee's approval for it." Barbara's eyes narrowed into slits. "The Fair Housing Act does not give you carte blanche to disrupt the aesthetic harmony of our community. Young lady, the ramp can stay, for now. But you will submit a retroactive application, and you will have it painted the correct shade of beige within 10 days. Consider this your first and only verbal warning." She turned her back on us, a silent dismissal, and marched away. The movers stood frozen, a heavy box of books held between them, their faces a mixture of pity and disbelief. I looked at Chloe, who was sitting in her chair at the bottom of the ramp, her face pale. She forced a small, weak smile. "Well," she whispered, her voice laced with a weary irony, "I guess we know who the final boss is in this level." I tried to smile back, but the anger in my chest was a cold, heavy stone We had come here seeking sanctuary, a place to heal. Instead, we had found a new battleground. And the enemy wasn't a faceless corporation or a medical diagnosis. It was a woman in a white pantsuit, armed with a paint palette and an utter absence of human decency. The fight for our peace had just begun. My initial strategy for dealing with Barbara Petrov was dictated by a lifetime of cleaning up messes. I was the eldest of 4 siblings, the responsible one, the planner. My twin brothers, Jake and Matt, were different. They solved problems in a more direct, explosive fashion. My approach was always one of methodical de-escalation. I believed, perhaps naively, that most conflicts could be resolved with reason, patience, and an overwhelming amount of documentation. Following Barbara's pronouncement, I spent my first evening in our new home not unpacking, but drafting a polite, professional letter to the HOA board. I cited the specific sections of the Fair Housing Act that protected our right to reasonable accommodation. I explained that dictating the color of a necessary medical device was an overreach of the HOA's authority and could be construed as a form of discrimination. I included a copy of the installer's invoice and the ramp's specifications, proving it met all safety and building codes. I was building a fortress of logic, assuming my opponent was a rational actor. This was my first mistake. The response was not a letter, but a formal notice of violation, slipped under our door 2 days later. It was printed on thick, embossed cardstock. The violation: unapproved exterior modification wheelchair ramp, non-compliant color. The fine was $50 per day, retroactive to the day of installation. A handwritten note at the bottom, in Barbara's severe, spiky script, read, "The FHA is not an excuse for poor taste. Paint the ramp." This was the opening salvo in a relentless siege of petty tyranny. A week later, another notice arrived. Chloe's golden retriever, Gus, was a violation. He was Chloe's certified emotional support animal, a gentle giant whose quiet, steady presence was a balm to her soul. The HOA bylaws, Barbara's notice gleefully pointed out, stipulated that all pets must weigh less than 20 pounds. Gus, at a lean 75 pounds, was a gross violation. The fine was a flat $500 plus an additional $25 for every day the unauthorized animal remained on the premises. Again, I responded with logic. I sent the board a copy of Gus's certification, along with a letter from Chloe's doctor, explaining that he was not a pet, but a necessary component of her mental and emotional health care. The response was another fine, this time for the small, discreet handrails I had installed in the hallway just outside our unit, which helped Chloe transition from her chair to the walker she used for physical therapy. The handrails were, of course, unapproved. I attended the next HOA meeting, held in a soulless community room that smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation. The board consisted of Barbara, seated at the head of a long table, and 2 other residents, a nervous-looking man who seemed to be sweating profusely, and a woman who stared at her folded hands the entire time. It was not a board. It was a queen and her terrified courtiers. I presented our case, my voice calm and measured. I spoke of federal law, of medical necessity, of basic human decency. Barbara listened with an expression of profound boredom, as if I were a particularly dull child reading a book report. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," she said, addressing the other 2 board members without looking at me. "Are we in agreement that the bylaws are clear on these matters?" They both mumbled their assent, their eyes darting everywhere but at me. "Then, the fines stand," Barbara declared, banging a small, ridiculous gavel on the table. "Mr. Carter, You and your sister chose to live in a community governed by rules. You do not get to pick and choose which ones you follow based on your circumstances. Pay the fines, paint the ramp, and remove the dog. It is that simple. I walked out of that room with the cold realization that logic was a useless weapon here. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a crusade. To Barbara, Chloe's ramp, her dog, her very presence, were imperfections in the pristine, orderly world she ruled. We were a disruption to the aesthetic harmony, and she was determined to regulate us out of existence. That night, I called my brothers. They were on deployment. Somewhere hot and dusty where the calls were never good. "Hey, Sar." Jake's voice crackled through the satellite phone. "You okay? You sound stressed." "Just new neighbor stuff," I said, trying to downplay it. "An HOA president who's a real piece of work." Matt's voice joined the call. "What did she do?" I explained the situation. I could feel their anger vibrating across the thousands of miles of ocean and desert between us. "That's illegal as hell." "Sarah," Jake said, his voice losing its easygoing warmth. "She's targeting a disabled person. It's a federal crime." "I know. I'm handling it." I said, "I'm documenting everything. Building a paper trail." "Good," Matt said, his voice a low rumble. "You build the dossier. If she crosses the line from bureaucratic nonsense to something else, you call us. We'll come home." "It won't come to that," I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. "Hope you're right," Jake said, "but hope isn't a strategy. Keep your head on a swivel." I hung up the phone feeling a strange mix of comfort and dread. My brothers lived in a world of black and white, of threats and responses. I lived in the gray, in the world of paperwork and procedure. But I was beginning to feel the gray fading, the edges of the conflict becoming sharper and more defined. The fines were just the beginning. The next escalation would be more direct, and I knew I had to be ready for it. The shift from bureaucratic warfare to a more personal, physical campaign of intimidation began subtly. It was a series of small, deniable acts designed to make us feel unwelcome and unsafe in our own home. Chloe found her greatest joy in a small, raised garden bed in the community green space. It was designated for her, an accommodation the previous, more reasonable HOA board had approved. She spent hours there, her hands in the rich soil, cultivating prize-winning roses. One morning, we went out to find the bushes trampled, the delicate blooms crushed into the dirt. Several of the main stems were bent and broken. There were muddy footprints all around the bed, larger than my own. It could have been teenagers, but I knew in my gut it wasn't. A few days later, the automatic door opener I had installed on our front door, a device that allowed Chloe a measure of independence, began to malfunction. I checked the mechanism and found the main sensor had been deliberately smudged with a thick, greasy substance, blocking its signal. It was a small thing, easily cleaned, but deeply invasive. Someone had stood on our porch, right outside our door, and intentionally disabled a piece of her medical equipment. Then came the incidents with Gus's water bowl. We kept it on our shaded patio. 3 times in 1 week. We found it kicked over. The water spilled, the bowl skittering across the concrete. Gus was a calm dog. He never knocked it over. This was a deliberate act of petty cruelty, an attack on an animal whose only crime was loving my sister. Each incident was a small cut, a minor wound in the fabric of our new life. But they were accumulating, creating a pattern of targeted harassment that was impossible to ignore. After the discovery of the trampled roses, I followed my brother's advice. I purchased and installed a set of high-end, discreet security cameras. One was positioned to overlook our front door and patio. Another, disguised as a landscape light, had a clear view of the community garden. And a third was a wide-angle lens covering the specialized van we used for Chloe's transport. I wasn't just building a paper trail anymore. I was gathering intelligence. My days in logistics had taught me the value of data. Every event, no matter how small, was a data point. And the data was painting a very clear picture. I started a new, more detailed file on my laptop. It was no longer just a collection of documents. It was a dossier. I created a timeline, linking each official notice from Barbara with a subsequent act of vandalism. I cross-referenced the times of the incidents with my own logs of when Barbara was seen near our property. It was what Jake and Matt would call pattern of life analysis. I was identifying the enemy's tactics, predicting her movements. But Barbara's next move was one I couldn't physically block. She escalated from physical intimidation to a campaign of public shaming and slander, designed to turn the entire community against us. She used the Lakeside Vista's private online forum as her bully pulpit. Her first post on the matter was a masterclass in passive-aggressive malice. It was titled, "A Note on Community Resources and Responsibilities." Dear neighbors, it began. As you know, our HOA fees are used to maintain the beauty and integrity of our shared spaces. It is a system that relies on the fair and equal use of our resources. However, when certain residents require accommodations that go above and beyond the norm, it can place a strain on our budget and our community's spirit of fairness. While we are, of course, a compassionate community, we must also be vigilant against those who might seek to take advantage of that compassion. It is crucial that we ensure all requests for special treatment are legitimate and that they do not place an undue burden on the rest of the community, who pay their dues and follow the rules without complaint. The post was a vile piece of work. She never used our names, but she didn't have to. We were the only new residents with special accommodations. She was painting us as grifters, as a financial drain on the neighborhood. She was questioning the legitimacy of Chloe's disability, a disability that had been adjudicated in a court of law and was documented by a mountain of medical records. The comments section was a horrifying mix of sycophantic support for Barbara and thinly veiled suspicion directed at us. Thank you for your diligence. Barbara, it's important to protect the community's finances. Fairness is key. Everyone should have to follow the same rules. I saw their van parked near the curb the other day. It's very large. It makes it hard to see when you're backing out. The social climate changed overnight. The few neighbors who had been friendly and welcoming now averted their gaze. We were ostracized, whispered about. I saw a group of women at the community pool fall silent and turn away when Chloe wheeled herself onto the patio. The isolation was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak of suspicion and judgment. The place that was supposed to be our sanctuary was becoming a prison. Chloe, who had been so resilient, so determined to build a new life, began to withdraw. She stopped going to the garden. She made excuses not to go to the pool. The light in her eyes, the one I had fought so hard to protect, was beginning to dim. This was Barbara's true goal. She wasn't just trying to get us to paint a ramp. She was trying to break my sister's spirit. She was trying to make our lives so miserable, so lonely, so filled with constant, low-grade hostility, that we would simply give up and leave. I documented everything. I took screenshots of every post, every comment. I made a note of every cold shoulder, every whispered comment I overheard. The dossier grew thicker, heavier. The data points were coalescing into a single, undeniable conclusion. This was a systematic, malicious campaign of targeted harassment against a disabled person. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Barbara was nowhere near finished. She had tried rules. She had tried intimidation. She had tried social pressure. Her next move would be to bring in a higher authority, to use the law itself as a weapon against us. The first time Barbara sent the police to our door, it was almost laughable. It was a noise complaint, called in at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. The noise was the low, rhythmic whir of the portable machine Chloe used for her daily physical therapy, an activity prescribed by her doctors to maintain muscle tone. The two officers who responded were young and looked more bored than anything else. I explained the situation, showed them the machine, and they left, rolling their eyes. The second time, it was less funny. Barbara had called in a welfare check. She had told the 911 dispatcher that she hadn't seen us in 2 days, and, knowing my sister was a vulnerable, disabled person, she was gravely concerned for our safety. It was a transparent ploy to get the police inside our home, to invade our privacy under the color of law. 2 different, more serious officers arrived. They insisted on entering the condo and speaking with Chloe alone to ensure she wasn't being held against her will. Chloe, a woman who valued her privacy and independence above all else, was humiliated. She was forced to answer questions about her care, her health, her relationship with me, as if she were a child or a prisoner. The officers were just doing their job, but the experience left her shaken and angry. The third time was the one that broke something inside me. It was the moment the line was irrevocably crossed. It was a Friday evening. We had just returned from a late doctor's appointment and were tired. I had parked our specially equipped van in the loading zone in front of our building for a few minutes, its hazard lights flashing, so I could help Chloe out and get her settled before moving the van to its assigned spot. Suddenly, the quiet evening was shattered by the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser, which pulled up aggressively behind our van. An officer, his hand on his holstered weapon, approached my door. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his voice sharp and loud. "Officer, what's going on?" I asked, my heart hammering in my chest. "We received a report of a suspicious vehicle matching this description, casing the neighborhood. The caller mentioned a possible domestic disturbance." I saw Barbara then, watching from the window of her condo, a silhouette in the dim light, a spider in her web. She had fabricated a story that was guaranteed to elicit a high-level, immediate police response. I got out of the van, my hands raised. Another officer went to the passenger side and shone a bright flashlight into Chloe's face. She flinched, shielding her eyes. "Ma'am, are you okay?" the officer asked, his tone accusatory. "Are you here of your own free will?" They questioned us on the curb for 20 minutes. They separated us, asking me what I was doing, asking Chloe if she was safe. Neighbors came out onto their porches to watch the spectacle, the disabled woman in her wheelchair, and her brother being interrogated by the police under the flashing lights of a cruiser. The humiliation was absolute. It was a public branding, a deliberate act of theatrical degradation designed to paint us as criminals, as dangerous outsiders. After running our IDs and finding nothing, the officer's demeanor softened. "Look," the first officer said, a hint of apology in his tone. The caller was very specific. "We have to follow up. But this is the third call we've had about this address. It's starting to look like a pattern of malicious reporting. You might want to talk to a lawyer." "I have one," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. They left. The flashing lights were gone, but the shame and anger remained, a toxic residue in the air. I looked at Chloe. Her face was a pale mask of exhaustion and despair. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I can't do this anymore. Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't live like this. She's never going to stop." I knelt in front of her wheelchair, my hands on her knees. I looked into her eyes, and the fury in my heart was so cold and so absolute, it felt like a physical object. "Yes, she is," I said, my voice a low promise. "She is going to stop. I'm going to make her stop." That was the moment the campaign of documentation ended and the counteroffensive began. Barbara had used the law as a weapon of harassment. Now, I would use it as a weapon of justice. She had pushed and pushed, assuming she was dealing with a pair of isolated, vulnerable victims. She had no idea who my family was. She had no idea who my brothers were. She had just made the final, catastrophic mistake of her petty, miserable crusade. The breaking point was not a single event, but the culmination of all of them, crystallized in a final, unforgivable threat. After the public humiliation with the police, I knew I could no longer handle this with letters and documentation alone. Barbara had escalated beyond the bounds of civil discourse. I needed to confront her, to make it clear that a line had been crossed. I found her the next morning, directing the landscaping crew with the imperious air of a general commanding an army. I walked up to her, my every movement calm and deliberate. "Barbara," I said, my voice low but firm, "we need to talk." She turned, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Carter, other than to remind you that your fines are now past due. The board will be meeting next week to discuss placing a lien on your property. Your calls to the police were a criminal act. Barbara, filing false reports is a crime." She laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "I was merely being a concerned citizen. It's not my fault if the police are a bit overzealous. Perhaps if you and your sister didn't present such a disorderly picture, citizens wouldn't be so concerned." The sheer audacity of her statement, the complete lack of remorse, was staggering. "You are targeting and harassing a disabled woman," I said, my voice dropping. "You are violating federal law. You are exposing yourself and this entire community to a massive lawsuit." Her smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted venom. She took a step closer, her personal space invasion a classic intimidation tactic. "Let me be perfectly clear," she hissed, her voice a low, menacing whisper. "You and your sister are the problem here. You are a drain. You come in here with your demands, your special equipment, your situation, and you expect all of us to bend to your will. This community is for normal, contributing members who follow the rules. It is not a charity ward. It is not a nursing home." She then looked past me, her eyes locking on my condo window where Chloe was sitting, watching us. Her voice dropped even further, laced with a chilling cruelty. "If I were you, I would think very carefully about my next move. A lien is just the beginning. We can make your life a living hell. We can bury you in legal fees. We can, and we will get you out. People like you don't belong here. You should just leave before things get even more unpleasant." The threat was absolute. It was a declaration of total war, and it was aimed not just at me, but at the sister I had sworn to protect. She had threatened our home, our financial stability, and she had done it with a casual cruelty that turned my blood to ice. I didn't say another word. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply held her gaze for a long moment, my expression a blank mask. I let her think she had won. that her threat had landed and silenced me. Then, I turned my back on her and walked away. I went inside, my movements calm, almost robotic. Chloe looked at me, her face etched with worry. What did she say? She said it's time to call the boys, I replied, my voice devoid of all emotion. I walked into my office and closed the door. On the wall was a framed photo. It was of the four of us, taken years ago, before the accident. I was in the middle, Chloe on my lap. On either side of us stood my younger brothers, Jake and Matt. They were identical twins, both 6'3", with the same quiet, intense eyes and the same unnervingly calm demeanor. In the photo, they were wearing their navy dress whites, the tridents pinned to their chests gleaming. I picked up my phone. I didn't call the main line for their consulting firm. I dialed Jake's satellite phone, the encrypted number he had given me for true emergencies. He answered on the first ring. Sarah, what's wrong? He could tell from the silence. She threatened to evict us. She threatened Chloe. I said, my voice flat. She called her a drain. Said people like her don't belong here. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence was more terrifying than any shout could have been. Then, I heard Matt's voice in the background. What is it? It's time, Jake said, his voice now a quiet, deadly calm. Barbara Petrov just crossed the event horizon. He came back on the line to me. We're 2 hours out from Dubai. We'll be on the next flight to the States. Send us the dossier. All of it. The new HOA hearing is next week, right? Wednesday, I confirmed. Good, Jake said. That gives us time to prepare the battlefield. Just hang on. SAR. The cavalry is coming. I hung up the phone. A strange sense of calm washed over me. For months, I had been fighting this battle with logic, with paperwork, with a system that was being manipulated by a petty tyrant. But the rules of engagement had just changed. I had just called in a force of nature. Barbara Petrov thought she was fighting a tired, stressed-out caregiver and a woman in a wheelchair. She had no idea she had just declared war on two of the most elite, intelligent, and dangerous men on the planet. She wanted a fight. Now, she was going to get one. The week leading up to the HOA hearing was the longest of my life. Barbara, emboldened by what she perceived as my submission, was relentless. Notices were plastered on the community bulletin board announcing the special hearing. The agenda item was clinical and cruel. Vote on the levying of accumulated fines and the initiation of foreclosure proceedings against Unit 2B for continued and unremedied bylaw violations. She was going for the kill shot. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, my brothers were in motion. After I emailed them the complete dossier, every photo, every video clip, every scanned document, every audio recording, the communication from them became sparse and professional. It was like I was a client and they were a crisis management team. Asset confirmed. Jake texted me after they landed. Intel package is comprehensive. We are moving to Phase 1 analysis and reconnaissance. They didn't come home right away. They flew into a city 2 states over, setting up a base of operations. They didn't want to tip their hand. For the next few days, my only job was to observe and report, to be their eyes and ears on the ground. I felt like a field agent. I documented Barbara's movements, the comings and goings of her board allies, the whispers in the community. The night before the hearing, they finally arrived. There was no fanfare. A quiet, dark sedan pulled into my driveway long after midnight. The door to my condo opened, and they were just there. Jake and Matt. They were bigger than I remembered. Or maybe it was just the intensity they carried with them. They were dressed in simple, functional civilian clothes, dark jeans, plain t-shirts, but they moved with a disciplined silence that was unnerving. They filled the space, their presence a tangible thing, a low-level vibration of controlled power. They hugged me first, a fierce, protective embrace, and then they both knelt beside Chloe's wheelchair. "Hey, Chloe," Matt said softly, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers. "Heard you've been having some trouble with a local warlord." Chloe, who had been a bundle of nerves all week, broke into a genuine, relieved smile for the first time in months. "You have no idea," she said. "She has a gavel and everything." "Not for long," Jake said, his eyes dark. For the next 2 hours, we sat at my dining room table, which they had turned into a command center. They didn't speak of anger or revenge. They spoke of strategy, of leverage points, of psychological drivers. "Barbara Petrov is the center of gravity," Jake said, pointing to her picture on his tablet. "But her power isn't absolute. It relies on two things: the perceived legitimacy of the HOA's authority, and the apathy and fear of the other residents. So we remove the legitimacy, and we neutralize the fear," Matt added, his voice a low counterpoint. "We've already initiated the legal counteroffensive," Jake explained. "We retained a lawyer for you, a guy from our old network, specializes in FHA violations and racketeering cases. He's already filed an intent to sue, naming Barbara and the HOA for a sum that will get their immediate attention. He also forwarded the entire dossier to the state's Attorney General's office, flagging the potential criminal charges: harassment, filing false police reports, and financial misconduct." My jaw dropped. Financial misconduct. Matt pulled up a new file on his screen. It was a series of financial records. We ran a check on the HOA's vendors, the landscaping company, the pool maintenance crew, the security firm. They all charge about 30% above market rate, and they're all owned by holding companies that trace back to Barbara's brother-in-law. She's not just a tyrant, she's a thief. She's been skimming off the top for years. The pieces clicked into place. Her obsession wasn't just about power. It was about protecting her criminal enterprise. We weren't just a nuisance. We were a threat. If we sued and her books were opened, she'd be exposed. "So, the hearing tomorrow," Jake said, leaning forward, "is not a defense. It's an ambush. We're not there to plead your case. We're there to dismantle hers, publicly and completely. We will strip her of her perceived authority, and we will expose her as a liar and a crook. We will give the other residents not just a reason, but the courage to stand up to her." He looked at me, his expression serious. "But you and Chloe are the main effort. We're just the support element. You have to be the one to face her. We'll be there, but you're the one who lands the finishing blow." The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. The community room was packed. Barbara sat at the head table, flanked by her two bored cronies, a smug, confident look on her face. This was her moment of ultimate triumph. She held a thick file, our file, in her hands. Chloe and I sat in the front row. I could feel the stares of the other residents, a mixture of hostility, pity, and curiosity. Barbara banged her gavel. "This special hearing is now in session." She began, her voice ringing with authority. "The agenda is a vote on remediation for Unit 2B. The occupants have accumulated thousands of dollars in fines, have refused to comply with multiple directives, and have shown a consistent disregard for the rules and harmony of our community. She launched into a PowerPoint presentation, a meticulous, biased account of every violation: the ramp, Gus, the handrails. She painted us as defiant, ungrateful troublemakers. As she was switching to a slide titled Character and Conduct Concerns, the double doors at the back of the room opened. Jake and Matt walked in. A hush fell over the room. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. They were identical, their movements synchronized, their expressions calm and unreadable. They moved with a predatory grace that was utterly out of place in this sterile, beige room. They didn't take seats. They simply stood at the back, arms crossed, their quiet, intense gaze fixed on Barbara. She faltered for a second, her eyes flicking toward them, a flicker of confusion on her face. Who were these two intimidating men? She tried to recover, to push on with her presentation, but her voice had lost its confident edge. The entire dynamic of the room had shifted. The fear that had been directed at us was now slowly, surely, turning toward her. She finished her presentation with a flourish. Therefore, she concluded, I move that the board authorize our legal counsel to place a lien on Unit 2B and begin eviction proceedings. This was my cue. I raised my hand. Before you vote, I said, my voice clear and steady, I would like to present a rebuttal. Barbara sneered. You have 5 minutes. I only need 1. I said. I stood up and faced not the board, but the assembled residents. My name is Sarah Carter. For the past 3 months, my sister Chloe and I have been subjected to a relentless campaign of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination by our HOA president, Barbara Petrov. I projected a single image onto the screen from a flash drive I had prepared. It was a screenshot of Barbara's financial records, showing a direct payment from the HOA's landscaping contractor to a private account in her name. A gasp went through the room. This isn't about a beige ramp, I said, my voice ringing with a newfound power. This is about a woman who has been using her position to systematically embezzle your money. She targeted us because she was afraid a lawsuit would lead to her books being opened. She has lied to you. She has stolen from you. And she has used your fear of her to maintain her power. Barbara was on her feet, her face ashen. This is slander. This is inadmissible. The back doors opened again. This time, it wasn't my brother's. It was a man in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase. Actually, he said, his voice calm and authoritative, it's evidence. My name is Daniel Marcus. I'm an attorney representing Ms. Carter. And this, he held up a sheaf of papers, is a copy of the lawsuit we filed this afternoon against the HOA and Ms. Petrov personally for violations of the Fair Housing Act. And this, he held up another document, is a letter from the State Attorney General's office, informing you that you are under active investigation for criminal harassment and financial fraud. The room erupted into chaos. Barbara stared, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, her entire world collapsing in a matter of seconds. Her power, her authority, her carefully constructed kingdom, all of it, gone. Through the chaos, my brothers began to move. They didn't rush. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. They weren't a security detail. They were an honor guard. They stopped on either side of Chloe's wheelchair. Jake placed a hand on my shoulder. Matt placed his on Chloe's. They turned, and, as one, we moved toward the exit, the residents parting before us like the Red Sea. We didn't look back. The battle was over. The war was won. The resolution was as swift and total as the climax. In the face of the lawsuit and the criminal investigation, the HOA's board members, terrified of their own liability, immediately turned on Barbara. She was removed as president in an emergency vote that night. The two other board members resigned the next day. Barbara Petrov's downfall was absolute. The Attorney General's investigation uncovered years of embezzlement, leading to multiple felony charges for fraud, on top of the charges for filing false police reports. Faced with an avalanche of evidence, she pleaded guilty. She avoided prison due to her age, but was sentenced to 5 years of probation, was forced to pay back every cent she had stolen from the HOA, and had to sell her condo to cover her legal fees and the massive settlement she paid to us. An entirely new HOA board was elected, comprised of residents who were tired of the old regime. Their first act was to issue a formal, public apology to Chloe and me. They expunged every fine and worked with our lawyer to rewrite the community's bylaws, making them compliant, fair, and humane. The ramp was allowed to remain its beautiful, warm, sandy brown. Gus was officially welcomed as a beloved community resident. My brother stayed for another week, helping us replant Chloe's rose garden and reinforcing the handrails in the hallway. Their quiet, powerful presence a comfort. They left as they had arrived, with no fanfare, just a hug and a quiet, "Call us if you need anything." The atmosphere at Lakeside Vistas transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of communal relief and a newfound commitment to being actual neighbors. People started talking to each other. We were invited to barbecues. Chloe started spending her afternoons by the pool again, her sketchbook in her lap, Gus at her side. Her brilliant smile finally returned. Our sanctuary had been violated, our peace shattered. But in the end, we had fought for it and won. We had faced down the bully, not with threats or violence, but with truth, meticulous preparation, and the unshakable power of a family that stands together. Our new life had begun, not with the quiet we had expected, but with a righteous battle that had earned us a peace that was real, lasting, and far more meaningful than we could have ever imagined.